So the mollusks can be broken into more groups than this, but these are sort of the major groups. Sometimes you'll only see even these three as the major groups, but there are even others that are not included on here. So what we have is some type of ancestor that was a Lophotrochozoan ancestor. And remember the trochophore larvae, or this little type of spinning top type larvae that have a mouth, a digestive tract, and they feed and swim. And many, like I said, mollusks we said are aquatic, and many of them will have this type of larval stage at some point. In addition to that, many mollusks will then have this trochophore larvae transform or metamorphose into a villager larvae. So this is the trochophore. And the trochophore may then metamorphose or develop into a villager. So this is a larval shell. And this is the velum. So velum are like these two big lobes that are ciliated, and they can help them swim through the water and collect food to bring it into a mouth that then continues to bring it into a digestive tract here inside the animal. This is a larval shell, which in some is then lost, and in others actually remains as part of the eventual shell. So not really going into all the different aspects of development with the different groups, but that's just kind of something that the ancestors have, the trochophore larvae, that many of them have, but not all. And then something unique to the group in terms of larval development is this villager. So it's a really key, unique to mollusks type structure. In the last lecture, we went over the basics of mollusca. The drawing I had was a hypothetical ancestral mollusk, and it was really quite a bit like what we actually see in this group called the Polyplacophora, and a bit like the gastropods. And I'll just don't have the drawing up here of a gastropod, but I'll do a quick one just to give you the major differences between them. The Polyplacophora are a group called the chitons. I-T-O-N-S. And the chitons have 8 plates. That's the main thing. So the overall structure of a Polyplacophora is a lot like the hypothetical ancestral drawing that I had with all the basic features and everything else, except on the top of the animal, there's the animal here, they have, instead of one shell, there's 8 overlapping plates like this on their back, and then they can kind of like curl into a ball and cover themselves completely with those plates, and so they kind of go all the way out to the edges of the mantle cavity and completely protect the whole animal. They can also like suck down to a rock surface using these plates to kind of also grab onto that hard surface, and so there's no soft tissue exposed and protect themselves. They're often found in the oceans, in intertidal areas, and they do a very good job of holding on to rock even in really violent surf and crashing waves. And they mostly find them there as grazers, grazing on algae on the rocks. The gastropods, which I said is the other one that was kind of similar to the hypothetical ancestral mollusk, the way in which they're primarily different is here. So if this will be the shell. The key difference here is, so this is the gill, representing the gill type structure, and this chamber here is representing the mantle cavity. And they have a head and a foot and the mantle and all the different sort of layers and the way the organization is in the nervous system and digestive and everything else. But the main thing is here is just that the mantle cavity in the hypothetical ancestor was posterior. And here it's anterior. So that means this food comes in through the mouth and goes through the digestive tract to the stomach and then to the intestines. It comes out here and is dumped into the mantle cavity, which means as sort of a issue, kind of it's dumped kind of right on to the animal's head, or it's kind of into the cavity where the respiratory structures are, and this is the way like water would be flowing into that cavity instead of outward. So they just need to be able to push water and move it outward to be able to flush out the cavity and keep it clean. So it's just a bit of a problem. One of the reasons that this exists is that it makes it useful for the animal to be able to hide and protect itself from the shell. So it could very easily pull its head into the shell because it has this big cavity right behind it, and then pull the shell down over it to protect themselves. So it's very helpful for adaptation, avoiding being eaten, to have that cavity right there. That's one of the reasons why it's likely there. So two of the other groups we said are the most different, than what we talked about before, which is why I drew them up here, are the cephalopods and the bivalves. So look at the bivalves first. Okay, so bi means two, so two valves, right? And this really means there's kind of two shells. So it's two separate shells with a hinge. And so this is kind of representing one shell and kind of the main visceral mass of the animal. That's a term I didn't use in the last lecture, but it's generally the term that people use when they discuss like all the organs, the heart, the gills, everything of a mollusk, even the mantle. They're talking about this visceral mass, just kind of like all the living kind of tissue inside them there with all the organs. Now, what we have for the bivalves is typical, and so this is representing here the foot. Often it's used for digging. So many bivalves actually use that foot to kind of dig into sediment. And so the way that they're actually oriented is that if this is the sediment like this, the animal is buried under the sediment, and then what it has sticking up from the animal's body into the water, so this is water kind of flowing up here, are these two siphons. One siphon is an in-current siphon, bringing water in, and the other siphon is an out-current siphon, pushing water out. That's kind of how the gastropods don't really have the siphons like this, but they do kind of pull the water in sort of often to one side of this cavity and then push it out the other side. And so they're kind of pulling it in often along the gill side and then out along the anal side so they can kind of keep themselves clean from fouling. But here they have two totally separate siphons. Now, behind the siphons, as water comes in, we said these guys are mostly filter feeders. So what they're doing is they're sucking water down in. The water then passes over the gills. So there's respiration going on. But in addition to that, these animals are mostly filter feeders. So the gill structures are used to collect particles, and then those particles are moved through ciliary action up to a mouth, okay, which would be here. Won't be able to read that necessarily. It's kind of small, but the mouth would be kind of here, associated with the gills, and then leading into a stomach, which would lead into their digestive system, and then the anus kind of at the end of the intestines, leading to the out-current siphon, so that the waste can move out of the animal. So generally, we find many of the bivalves displaying this type of behavior. Some of them, the siphons, are gigantic and incredibly muscular. People will eat the siphons themselves of the animal because they are so large and muscular. Some bivalves don't burrow. They tend to attach to other hard surfaces using things called byssal threads. And they tend to have a very reduced foot because they are stuck. They're anchored or attached to one place, and they don't move around, and they're stuck on the surface. So mussels are a type of bivalve that do this. They often also live in intertidal areas in the ocean, and then they attach to rocks and pilings and other hard surfaces. They're acting as filter feeders there, so they have the siphons pulling the water in across their gills and so forth. Something else to mention for these guys, because it's sort of something that people might see or be familiar with, is there are muscles here, and these are called adductor muscles. All right, the significance of the adductor muscle is that the adductor muscle will contract. We said a muscle can only contract, and it pulls the two valves of the shell together and holds them down. There are typically around this hinge spring-like structures that are trying to pull the shell open, and then the muscles contract and pull the shell shut. So what happens is then when the muscles relax, those little spring-like structures then allow the shell to move open. So usually the opening is fairly slow, but they can close the shell very fast. Some of them use this to even swim, propel themselves. So it's kind of rare, but some of them can actually kind of clap the shell and actually push water and actually move through the water column. Not very much, but they can relocate, especially if they detect a predator, and they can kind of move away from it. So these adductor muscles are fairly small in some groups, but in others are very large. So a scallop, if you say you eat scallops, what you're actually eating is not the animal's visceral mass, you're eating the adductor muscle. If you eat a clam or oyster, what you're eating is actually the visceral mass. You're eating kind of the gills and stomach and the foot and other organs and things like that. So depending on what if you ever eat a mollusk or eat a bivalve, that's kind of the difference between what you'd be eating. So bivalves are a little bit arranged. They don't really have a head or cephalization. They've kind of lost that. So that's why they're kind of on their own kind of separate, sub-branch, within here. And again, there's a lot more to go into. There's so many different groups and unique things that they do. The scallops have little light sensors here along the mantle tissue, so with little eyes. So they have tons of eyes along there that they can kind of see with. A whole variety of interesting behavior. Some are very, very small, little coquina clams kind of living in the surf, or tiny, maybe only a centimeter or so in size as an adult, and others can be massive. They could be just these gigantic clams that are incredibly big. So there's a pretty good range in size of the bivalves. Same thing really with cephalopods, are really one of maybe the most enormous ranges in size, because we have giant squid, which are incredibly large, and then we can have some very, very small ones that are, again, only a few centimeters in length. But their overall anatomy is actually going to be pretty much the same, whether they're tiny or very large. So the foot of a typical gastropod has been modified here in the cephalopods into arms and tentacles. And so the way to tell the difference is that an arm has these suckers on it, and the suckers are along the whole length of the arm. A tentacle only has suckers kind of at the end, like this. There are no suckers all along the length of a tentacle. Typically, most squid, so octopi typically don't have tentacles, they just have the 8 arms. But squid will typically have the 8 arms plus 2 additional tentacles. And the tentacles are usually used to grasp their prey. And so they can shoot them out very fast and kind of grab hold of their food and then with the suckers and pull them in. Some of the suckers even have little sort of like hooks on them, as well. But mostly it's just the suction process that grabs onto their food. So they're mostly predators, this whole entire group. They're going to then bring food into their mouth. And here would be the radula. Okay, but in this case, the radula often is referred to as a beak. As I mentioned, that the structure is modified into more of a biting type structure, so they can use to tear into the tissue of their prey. So then they have a buccal mass, kind of like right behind it, and then that kind of leads down into their stomach and then intestines. So they have a siphon, as well, and then they can push water out that siphon. Usually, many of them will have kind of these two. Some of the pictures I was looking at to draw this, couldn't really find it, but they typically have 2 in-current siphons, and then 1 really large X-current siphon. So they kind of bring water in to their cavity here. The water can then pass over their gills for respiration, and then what they can do is then almost use a type of jet propulsion to push themselves really fast through the water column by forcing the water out through the excurrent siphon. So they typically have excurrent and incurrent, and these are siphons. So kind of like the bivalve siphons, as well, but with some modifications. They are, obviously they're cephalopods, so they display sort of the pinnacle, sort of more of extreme cephalization. So with a very well-developed head, with very large eyes and a brain, right? So this group really no longer just has ganglia. So we said ganglia were clusters of nerves and nerve cells along the nervous system. And often they do processing in some region of the animal's body. So for example, there are cerebral ganglia and pedal ganglia, in these guys. So they actually have separate ganglia kind of along the foot as well, from here, and then they could kind of have some visceral ganglia as well. So ganglia inside the area of the visceral mass, different places. Whereas all these are combined into an actual brain, and of all the invertebrate animals, which really make up the majority of all animals, the cephalopods have the largest kind of brain to body ratio, and they are very intelligent. And a lot of studies have been done on the intelligence of cephalopods, their ability to learn and have memory and a variety of different things, and they are very advanced. Which allows them to have a lot of complex behaviors, again, as predators. And in their own kind of social behavior. Some people study social behavior among cuttlefish and squid and octopi, and they have a lot of very interesting and different sorts of behavior. So, but continuing on here, so with the water flow, we said comes across gills. They typically have 2 gills, and then they have 2 hearts, one at the base of each gill. These are called branchial hearts. So water comes in, passes over here, diffusion of oxygen. There's blood vessels associated with this, and then branchial hearts are at the base, kind of pumping, it's pumped there. And then they have another heart here, a single one called a systemic heart. And so that is the central one that everything kind of feeds into, and then you have aorta and branches of their circulatory system that then continue to branch out throughout the animal's body from that systemic heart. There's, again, a ton of additional things to potentially talk about with these cephalopods, but again, our limit is just to kind of go over some of the basics of their biology. Typically, they're separate sexes for reproduction. They often will have very complicated mating behaviors, where males often compete with each other for the females. Many of them have within the skin of the organism, many of them will display chromatophores. Which are these little pigmented areas that actually have cells around them that can contract and expand to allow the pigment to be seen. And so they can essentially change their color, they can change patterns, and many of them, some of them can do this for camouflage, but many of them do it for communication. They actually send signals to one another by displaying different colors and patterns and flashing of these different colors and patterns from these chromatophores. So they have a very fine ability to control these structures and their overall appearance. And those are sort of the main things. So the major groups of mollusks would be the cephalopods, squid and octopi, the gastropods, which includes snails, and all the slugs. So there are both terrestrial slugs that don't have a shell and marine slugs that don't have a shell. Many of them have the shell actually in the larval stage, but then lose it as an adult because they don't want to carry it around with them, and they have other adaptations for protection. Bivalves have 2 shells, sort of, that are hinged together, and the Polyplacophora have 8 sort of plates making up their overall shell. And that's kind of the big picture of the breakdown of how the mollusks are organized.